All right, welcome to welcome to Friday Office Hours. My name is Sam Stewart. I will be your host for today's session. Today's presentation will be led by Dr. John Giannini, who is who will lead a discussion on assessing the data quality dimensions of surgical oncology cohorts in all of us. So we're very, very excited for him to present his work. I do have a few quick announcements that might be useful to you, and then I will introduce our speaker and pass it to him. So there is a new funding opportunity from the Healthy Americans Foundation. They're seeking to support 20 scholars using all of this data that are studying chronic disease in communities that are currently and previously limited in scientific research efforts. So if that applies to you, they're looking for those applicants. You can get up to $10,000 of support for your research projects. The applications are due by November 3rd, so scan the QR code to learn more about the requirements. So I'll give everyone a quick moment. Additionally, there's another funding opportunity. So applications are now open for 4 AIM Ahead training program spots. AIM Ahead is well versed in all of this data. So if you are a researcher that's looking to utilize AI or ML to generate meaningful research and information, AIM Ahead is it's a wonderful group. So they're selecting participants to receive an $8,000 stipend and $2,000 travel allowance to attend the 2026 AIM Ahead annual meeting that will be happening in the spring. So you can apply by, well, this is kind of past, but if you do have the information session passed, but if you have questions, you can email support@researchallofus.org so we can connect you with the information you need. And then the application deadline is actually due at the end of this month. So it's a pretty quick turnaround. So scan the QR code to learn more. All right. I would like to introduce our speaker today. Dr. John Giannini is a health science policy analyst at the NIH for the All of Us Research Programs Division of Technology and Platform Development. So he leads EHR data acquisition strategies, quality evaluation, and manages the CLAD award, which we at the DRC work closely with. So we're really excited to have him. This enhances the data set and gives more information about our data resources, et cetera. He holds a BS in physics from Gettysburg College and a PhD in biophysics from the University of Maryland. He joined all of us as an AAAS fellow, where he developed EHR data frameworks and led plannings for integrating medical imaging and emerging data types. So we're incredibly excited to have him present his work. So I'll start sharing my screen and pass it over to you, Dr. Giannini.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. Let me see if I can get this set up. As Sam mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about our work assessing data quality in surgical oncology cohorts. So just to give a rough outline of what I'm going to talk about today, the first section will be a background, and not so much a background in the sense of the background part of a manuscript or anything, but more like why the coordinating center and why the Division of Technology and Platform Development is interested in data quality. The next part will be about our work, about the surgical oncology paper, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we're working on now and some of our future efforts. Okay. So I wanted to do the acknowledgements part, the acknowledgement slide first, because what I'm about to present is kind of like a meta-analysis of 5 smaller papers. So it's too much work to present in a half hour, and it was too much work to attribute to myself. So I really want to call out all of my colleagues who contributed to this work first. My colleague, Dr. Matt Spotnitz, leads this work, and he's our expert on phenotyping and developing concept sets and clinical elements. And so if you have any questions that you feel like you would want a real doctor for, please put them in the chat. I think I saw him here. He can help me out with those. This effort, our data quality framework was developed by doctors Lou Berman and Ami Eshega, who really sort of started this effort and developed the framework. They are both recently retired. And then I'd also like to call out some of our other colleagues, Dr. Tamara Litwin, who is our resident epidemiologist and data scientist who helps us sort of rigorously improve our work, and Emily Clark and Lakshmi Anandan, who both contributed to developing the coding and the analysis work. Okay, so why is the technology division at all of us interested in working in the Workbench and interested in data quality. And the answer to that is we're curious to help researchers determine what our data is best used for. It's not equally good for all use cases. And so we're interested in sort of helping where we can to help researchers learn where our data is especially impactful. And then on the flip side of that, we're interested in looking into where are there gaps in our data? Where are we missing things? Where are we missing data from participants? And then the third reason why we're interested in this is how can we fix that second bullet? So how can we use passive data acquisition strategies like the ones that that CLAD award that Sam mentioned are working on to help fill in some of these gaps? So unfortunately, my work is mostly going to, or my talk today is going to mostly be about the second bullet, gaps, but we'll also talk a little bit about how to fix it. And so the downstream, the disclaimer on this presentation is that our work is strictly operational and there's no like new exciting scientific discoveries happening here today. So if you want to leave, I won't be offended. Now's your time. This is more of a data quality and analysis and less a cool new science talk. Okay, so I mentioned the data quality framework that Lou and Ami developed over the past couple of years. And the way we think about data quality is through these 5 different dimensions. And I'll just run through them real quick. So completeness is the sort of most basic check of, is the data there? Are there data related to what you're trying to look at for our participants? The second element is concordance, which is similarity or agreement in data values and elements. And the way to think about that is it's sort of, does our data set compare favorably or can compare with an external data set that you can use? Does it look the same? Conformance has to do with the ways that the data elements are represented. So with the OMOP common data model, there's what are called source and standard vocabularies where the clinical elements are coded. And so are the data elements represented in the same way with respect to sort of the metadata and the vocabularies? Plausibility is, are the data values and elements believable? So are there people that are 200 years old? Are there people that weigh 5,000 pounds? Are all of the elements believable? And then temporality, the way we think about that is, do the data elements follow an expected temporal pattern? So just to break it down a little more, I'll give a quick example using month and date of birth. So we can think about each one of these dimensions. Completeness, that sort of basic, that basic check is, how many participants do we have birth month and year for? Is the data there? Concordance is, does the distribution of birth months match the reference from the CDC? So does it compare to an external data set? Conformance, this one was a little harder, it's a bit of a stretch, but are all of the birth months from the Gregorian calendar? Or another way to think about it is, are they all in English or something like that? So are they represented the same way? And then plausibility, I kind of alluded to this, but are all of the birth years within the last 120 years or so? And then temporality, which is sort of the sort of expected pathway, expected temporal pattern. So are all of the birth years before or when participants enrolled with all of us? I would hope so. I think that we could agree that it should be like that, but that's another way of looking at data quality. Okay, and so this work that I'm presenting is building off of about three years of work. We first looked at these data quality elements with respect to DCIS, a kind of breast cancer diagnosis. We then expanded it to look at a comparison between partial and complete mastectomy cohorts. And then this work that I'm presenting today, like I mentioned, is kind of a meta-analysis of 5 different cohorts with different surgical oncology phenotypes. Okay, so the way we designed our cohorts is that they're nested case cohorts of adults that have at least some EHR data in the All of Us data set. And then the way we designed our cases is, do they have at least one occurrence of one of these surgeries related to cancer treatment. And so the five subcohorts that we looked at are mastectomy, prostatectomy, colectomy, melanoma, and lung cancer resection. And the mastectomy and prostatectomy cohorts were also restricted by sex at birth. And the control cohorts to compare each of those case cohorts to were adults with EHR data, but without that specific surgical procedure. Okay, so the way we build these cohorts, my colleague, Dr. Spotnet, sort of is an expert in developing concept sets. And so these are lists of vocabularies and codes that correspond with a surgical clinical element or like a surgical procedure. And so what I have here is a sort of excerpt from our mastectomy workbook, where this describes what concepts are we looking at to build this mastectomy cohort. What vocabularies did it come from? So they came from the CBT4 vocabulary. What OMOP table do they live in the Workbench? And then what is the corresponding OMOP concept ID that we can use to query these procedures? And so we build one of these large lists of codes for each one of our phenotype definitions, where we have a large list of mastectomy codes, a large list of colectomy codes, and so on. And that's how we define our cohorts for these phenotypes. The follow-on work from that, once we have our phenotype defined, is what are the common clinical elements and interventions that we would expect to find for someone with that phenotype. So for instance, with a mastectomy, with that primary procedure, we would expect to find these other procedures, conditions, measurements, and drugs. And so it's a variety of imaging tests like screening mammography, diagnostic mammography, treatments like primary courses of treatments like radiation, chemotherapy, a variety of other drug therapies, and then also some measurements and measurements like the estrogen receptor status or whether the participant has a BRCA mutation, and then also the sort of the underlying condition, which is we expect that they're getting this surgery in response to a breast cancer diagnosis. So we look at that as well. And so I wanted to get, because this is office hours and a little bit more technical, I wanted to get a little into the weeds of the Workbench code just for a slide or two. So I hope you'll forgive me. But the way that I thought about deploying this sort of data quality analysis in the Workbench is so Matt develops these lists of concept IDs related to each clinical element. I import those into the Workbench, bring them over, define each clinical element based on the codes that make it up. And then I sort of build a data structure to hold the name of that clinical element, what codes it comprises, any codes to exclude, and a few other variables. And then I went through an iteration of this work using SQL queries developed by the researcher Workbench, or by the cohort builder, and those worked pretty well. But I wanted to design a more dynamic way of putting together SQL queries, and so I made a function to take in a list of clinical elements that you're interested in looking at, and then design a SQL query comparable to the one that the cohort builder produces, but for each of those clinical elements. And then you send that query to BigQuery. It returns Pandas data frame that you can use to look at your base data quality analysis. And so this is the worst slide in the presentation. I apologize in advance, but I wanted to do a little pseudocode walkthrough just because I never get to talk about it, and I'm happy to sort of go back into this if necessary. But just to walk through those steps that I said on the last slide. So that at the top, we define each clinical element with the list of OMOP concept IDs that make it up. So as an example here, I have breast cancer and that BRCA mutation. Those are both found in the condition domain. And so we have this list of codes that make up the clinical element. Then we define that data structure I talked about. It's sort of a list of elements where you have the name, which table it resides in, the list of codes that make it up. And then you build this dynamic SQL query based on the list of elements. And so this is a vastly oversimplified version of the function, but basically it takes in this list of elements, it makes a base SQL query, which is exactly what you'd find from the cohort builder, and then it adds a column for each one of the elements you're interested in looking at. So it adds a column for breast cancer, it adds a column for the BRCA mutation, and any other clinical elements you give it. And what it fills, what it joins that column with, is the earliest occurrence of any one of those OMOP codes in the table that it corresponds with. So that's a lot, but basically, for the breast cancer element, that column will look at the condition table, because that's where the breast cancer diagnoses will be found. It queries, does this participant have any of this list of codes? If it does, give me the first occurrence of those and populate that column with this person. They had a first occurrence of a breast cancer diagnosis on this date. And so it does that for the entire participant cohort, the entire 633,000, and then it adds a column on for each one of the clinical elements that you're looking at. And what that lets you do, this is very made up notional data. Please don't think I'm exposing row level data. But what this lets you do is it gets you a summary, a big table with a summary of your entire cohort and how many of the different clinical elements that they have at least one occurrence of. And so here's like some notional data about what this could look like. You have a column for the sort of participant ID, some of their basic demographic information pulled in from the OMOP person table, like their age, sex at birth, race, and so on. And then you have, like I mentioned, a column for each one of those clinical elements that we put together. And if they have at least one occurrence of those elements, it'll read as the date that it first occurred. And if they don't have one of those clinical elements, it reads as null. And so I think that this is powerful in that it lets you, it's a big summary table that you don't have to query each one of your clinical elements in the like the condition table and the procedure table and get a ton of rows. It's just a summary, and it lets you know, does the cohort you're interested in have the other clinical elements that you're interested in? Okay, so that's the weedsy part of the talk. Now let's get to some sort of cool results and figures from the paper. So we looked at these 5 different cohorts, and we wanted to compare them using our both basic demographics and our sort of data quality dimensions. And so what this slide shows is 6 different plots, one for each of our 5 for one of our 5 surgical oncology cohorts, and one for the broader all of us population with at least some EHR data. So this was done in V7. So the population with EHR data was around 287,000 participants. And you can see the distribution of states that those participants come from. And then what you'll notice for the surgical oncology cohorts is that there's a lot of gray states with not very many or no data. And so what we found was that around 80% of each of our surgical oncology cohorts came from one of 8 states, those being Massachusetts, Arizona, California, Wisconsin, New York, Illinois, Florida, and Michigan. And that's in contrast to only around 65% of the all of us population comes from those states. So those 8 states that I mentioned, and especially Massachusetts, you'll notice that it's sort of red in most of the surgical oncology cohorts, are sort of over-indexing on these surgical oncology cohorts. Okay, so now to our data quality dimensions. The first that I'll talk about is conformance. That's that measure of how the data is represented and whether it's consistent across sort of different standards and vocabularies. And so I thought that the easiest way to do this is to look at one figure first, and then we can sort of break down what it's talking about, and then I'll show the sort of larger summary from all 5 of the surgical oncology cohorts. So This is a Sankey diagram of vocabulary mappings for the mastectomy cohort. And what that means is we have this list of sort of phenotype defining procedures that we define this mastectomy cohort with. When the person at the HPO or the healthcare center sort of types it into their EHR, they use one of these source vocabularies, mainly CPT4, but also the SNOMED vocabulary and the ICD vocabulary. So they're input as these sort of source codes. We do a mapping process to OMOP. One sort of quirk of the way we implement the OMOP common data model is that not all records in the procedure domain are mapped to SNOMED. Some of them are left in CPT4. And so what you'll see here are there's about 7,000 or so occurrences of these mastectomy codes. Most of them are in CPT4. Most of them stay mapped to CPT4, and then some of them are mapped to SNOMED or ICD. You can see going from left to right. And so what we find when we look at all 5 of our cohorts is that most of these procedure records are in the CPT4 vocabulary. And so you'll see our 5 surgical oncology cohorts, and it sort of ranges from about 2/3 of the records are in CPT4 to just about all of them for melanoma. And why this is impactful and why it's important is because when you're thinking about putting together a phenotype using these concept IDs, if you don't have a world expert like Matt that I had on my team, you need to be comprehensive in how you're assembling these lists of clinical elements to make sure that you're capturing both CPT4 vocabularies and ICD and SNOMED. The cohort builder is good about this. There's a little tab, like a toggle bar you can switch in the upper right-hand corner of the cohort builder that lets you look at source vocabularies as well, which is really important for these procedure cohorts, procedure-based cohorts, because so many of these records are from the CPT4 domain, or the CPT4 vocabulary. Okay, and so the next data quality dimension that I want to talk about is completeness. This is there data related to the things I'm interested in dimension. And so what you see on the left is a plot of our sort of 15 or 16 clinical elements from the mastectomy cohort that we looked at, with the blue bars being the percent of the cohort that had that element for the case cohort, and the red bars being the percent of that sub-cohort that had those elements for the control cohort. And on the right, just in case you're not a bar graph person, I broke those down. By what percentages of those sub-cohorts had the codes. And so for all concepts, this follows logically. For all of the concepts, you'll see that the rate for the mastectomy case cohort is greater than the rate for the control cohort, which is a good sort of sanity check. But where the completeness sort of falls short a little bit is in the amount, like the percentage of the cohort that has what you would expect to be a standard workup. So you would expect, I think the number is around half of participants that undergo mastectomy to also have radiation. We're seeing it at around 40%. And so we're potentially missing some data. It's possible that our data came from a cohort that was treated slightly different, but it's also possible that these people got radiation treatment at a hospital that we didn't know about, and so we're not getting those records. Okay, and so this is a little overwhelming, but this is all of the clinical elements that we're looking at for each of our 5 sort of surgical cohorts. And just to pull out sort of big themes, all of our case cohort percentages were larger than the control cohorts, which means the cohorts with these conditions, with these surgical procedures that we'd expect to have all of these clinical elements as a part of their treatment, have them at greater rates than the people that don't, which is a good thing. But for a large amount of these clinical elements that we'd expect to be in a standard treatment, we're missing what we would expect to be a proportional amount of them. So like I mentioned, we're missing some radiation records, we're missing some biopsy records, and a few other ones that we'd expect to be standard. We're not seeing at the rate that we would expect. And so, yeah, I think that's a good overview. I don't want to get too in the weeds. There's a lot of clinical elements here. Another way we think about completeness, in addition to do we see the clinical elements we'd expect, is there a match between the surgical procedure that we're looking at and the underlying condition? And so what you see here is the blue circle is this cohort with mastectomy surgeries. The pink circle, the salmon circle, is the cohort with a breast cancer diagnosis, and then the sort of light pink overlap in the middle is the percentage of the cohort that has both. And so I'm not an MD. I don't know what percentage of breast cancer patients you would expect to have a mastectomy, but I think from talking to Matt, it's larger. It's larger than we're seeing here. And conversely, for the people that have mastectomy surgery record, we would expect the vast majority of those to have an underlying diagnosis. And so perhaps we're missing some underlying breast cancer diagnoses as well. And so we see this across all 5 of our surgical oncology cohorts. So if you look at all of them, it ranges you can see kind of ranges for the amount of that overlap. But out of the total cohort that had either a cancer diagnosis or the corresponding surgery, somewhere between 10 and 30% had both across all of our cohorts. So what that means is when we're only seeing 10 to 30 have both a surgery and the underlying diagnosis, we expect that there's some missingness in both of those groups. All right, so one other way we think about completeness, and I've kind of alluded to this in some of the previous slides, is for what we would consider to be a standard sort of treatment pathway, do we see a lot of participants that have that whole pathway? And so what this table shows is for each of our 5 cohorts, what are the most frequent combinations of clinical elements that we see participants have? And so like, if a participant has just the surgery record, it'll show up as surgery only. If they have surgery with some of the other clinical elements, they'll be listed there. And so I've highlighted in bold what we would consider to be a more complete set of clinical elements, meaning that it has the surgery, some imaging, and a biopsy at least. And what you'll see is that there's a lot of participants here that only have the surgery record or only have the surgery and some associated imaging or something like that. And so what that suggests is that either these participants are being treated differently or they're getting their care at a series of different doctors, not all of which we're capturing. Okay, and so the next data quality dimension that I'll talk quickly through is temporality. And so the way that we looked at this for the surgical oncology cohorts is to look at for the subcohorts that have both a biopsy and a following procedure, this surgery, what is the median and sort of quartile range of the time from the biopsy to the surgery. And so this chart shows the 5 cohorts with box and whiskers for the median number of weeks between the biopsy procedure and the surgery procedure. And what you'll see is that the medians are between 5 and 11 weeks for each of the cohorts, which is pretty reasonable. I think that mostly follows what we would expect. But there's this sort of large upper tail of up to 5 or 6 years between the biopsy procedure and the corresponding surgery. And so this could be real, like this could be the real way that it was treated. And it could also be that we're missing either a more recent biopsy that led to the surgery, or we're missing a surgery that occurred closer to the initial biopsy. Okay, so the last two data quality dimensions are concordance and plausibility. We talk about these in the work some, but these two are especially difficult to assess without an external validation. So I mentioned like you might compare the distribution of birth months to the CDC's sort of gold standard. And so without a direct analog to compare our data to, it's difficult to do that external validation. But what we did look at is for concordance, which is the clinical data is represented the same way, or not represented. It looks the same. We computed bivariate correlations between the concept set pairs and found that there weren't a whole lot of pairs that had a strong correlation between them, suggesting that participants don't have the exact same sets of clinical elements very often. And then the last data quality dimension is plausibility, which is like this passes the smell test, this data makes sense. And so what we looked at there was we compared the age distribution for our cohorts to the clinical expectation and found that it matched quite well. We also looked at for our lung cancer cohort, we looked at our survey data to see, does our cohort with lung cancer surgeries have more of a history of smoking than our control cohort, and found that the sort of median length of smoking was about 30 years for our surgery cohort compared to 19 years for our control cohort. Okay, and so now I just have a couple slides to wrap up and talk a little bit about what we're working on now. So the three sort of focus areas for me and for our team are we're working on expanding this analysis to different diseases. Over the past 6 months or so, we've extended this work to look at arthritis and inflammatory bowel disease. And so both of those are submitted manuscripts that we're very happy with that are under review. We're looking to expand it to more conditions in the future, and we're sort of have some in the pipe. We're also looking to we're looking to become a little more rigorous in the way we look at temporality. And so I plotted that, I showed that plot from the time between biopsy and surgery. And I'll talk a little bit on the next slide about how we're trying to get a little more rigorous about that. And then the last thing I'll talk about real quickly is what this has been building towards, and what I'm excited to hopefully offer as a resource soon, is generalizing this workflow and taking it to the point where you can sort of tell us a list of concepts that you're interested in, and it'll spit out sort of an automated data quality check based on that list. Okay, and so I mentioned that we extended our work to look at arthritis. And so what this plot shows is a new way that we're thinking about temporality and that we implemented for our arthritis analysis. And what this shows is we looked at the sub-cohort of our participants with an arthritis diagnosis that had a representative set of concepts. And so Matt developed this list of five clinical elements that we would really expect to see in sort of a common treatment pathway. So we looked at the sub cohort that had all five. And then we looked at the order, so the order that each participant first encountered those concepts and the amount of time it took them to move from step to step. And so what you see if you start at the bottom left, I showed the top 3 pathways. And by the top 3 pathways, I mean each participant that followed that pathway had exactly that ordering of concepts. And so pathway number 1 in black had 221 participants that followed that exact pathway. Pathway number 2 had 191, and number 3, 132. And what you'll find is that most participants had glucocorticoids or NSAIDs diagnosed first. That kind of makes sense that if you're having pain, try glucocorticoids or an NSAID to see if that helps the pain. And then all of those participants then move on to a rheumatoid factor measurement test. And then were either prescribed a DMARD, a sort of more specific medication for arthritis, or were formally diagnosed with arthritis. And so this helps us sort of track the flow of how participants move through the common treatment pathways and look at how long it took between steps. All right, and so I guess I promised that the pseudocode was my messiest slide, but this might be worse. This is what I hope is the end state of this analysis, where you can sort of make a list of clinical elements in Excel that you're interested in looking at following this format, feed it into this automated workbook in the Workbench, and it'll spit out sort of most of the things I've talked about today, like the basic data quality analysis. And so this is just an example of what an input could look like, where you have your list of clinical elements on the left, what OMOP domain you find them in, the codes that are associated, the OMOP concept IDs that are associated with each one, and then a few other columns that help the workflow work. And then just one more sliding inclusion. So what we found, it's complicated to summarize these 5 big cohorts that we looked at and all of their associated clinical elements. But in general, what we found is that we're missing things we would expect to see. And on average, we found we're missing a little bit more of what we'd expect to see in the procedure and measurement domains. And so we think that this is more attributable to fragmentation of care than necessarily data curation. But from what we can see in the Workbench, it's hard to sort of make that diagnosis with confidence. And so what we're looking into as the technology division at all of us is how can we take these sort of gaps that we've identified and use passive data collection to help supplement those gaps. And so we've implemented a method to allow participants to link outside records that get brought into our database. And we're also exploring other methods that we can use to capture records outside of the HPO network, where people might get some of their surgical oncology care, for instance. And we're hoping that if we keep sort of building the completeness of our records, that it will enable more use cases for researchers to do impactful precision medicine work with. So that's all I have. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.